Okay. So welcome everybody to today's presentation. Just a few housekeeping items as we go. If you just wanted to keep yourselves on mute while the presentation is going on, then feel free. You could unmute yourself to ask any questions, or if you feel more comfortable wanting to use a text chat, you could do that and I'll watch for those questions. Yeah, so I would like to just take a minute here to introduce Amy. So Amy Knox is licensed in Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. She has spent the last 8 years in the industry and has been a broker since 2019. She's been with BrokerLink since 2022 and prior experience as an analyst, personal lines broker, trainer, and technical support. So I just wanted to welcome you, Amy. And thanks very much, for doing the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever you're ready, I think I should be able to share my screen now.
Yeah, for sure you are. Let you know if we could see.
Yeah, perfect. Here's my slideshow.
Hello. Yeah, we could see it good.
Perfect. All right. Any other questions before I get started, or we're good to go?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. So yeah, well, I'll watch it and let you know if there's any questions there. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Lori. All right. So as Lori mentioned, my name is Amy Knox. I work for BrokerLink Insurance, as you'll note here. I am based out of the Thunder Bay office. I believe most people are probably local as well to Northwestern Ontario. But of course, we do business kind of province-wide. So today, Lori asked me to do a presentation here for business insurance. So a lot of people are entrepreneurs, whether you have a new venture or an existing business, insurance is something that comes up quite a bit. And unfortunately, not a lot of people are familiar with the product and what that actually entails. So I'm happy to go through that today and hopefully get a bit more information and clarification for people. So I'll start off just with my little introduction here. Lori did mention a lot of this, but I'm a broker, a licensed broker. I am licensed in a few different provinces, so Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. I have a Bachelor of Arts degree from Wilfrid Laurier University, and I also have my Canadian Accredited Insurance Broker designation. I'm going into the industry for 8 years now. I've been a broker dealing with the public for the past 3.5 years now, and I've been with BrokerLink for about 1.5 years. So as you mentioned as well, I have held other positions, both on the carrier side of things, so for the actual insurance companies, but also as a broker. So I have a bit of different knowledge in different areas, and I think that that's really helped with different clients who have a lot of smaller businesses, or even for Northern Ontario, we have a wide variety of people who have different endeavors, and there's a lot more nuances when it comes to smaller communities. I find that there's a bit of a difference compared to kind of Southern Ontario and even other larger populations where it's very kind of cookie cutter type businesses, whereas here we have a diverse group of people and diverse businesses. So our quick agenda here. So we'll go over 4 main topics. So we'll kind of address what insurance actually is, why you might need insurance, the different types available to you, and how we can go about actually obtaining the insurance. If we have any questions afterwards, of course, I'm happy to stay around and chat. If anybody has any questions throughout, of course, if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead. I'm fine with that. Or if you'd rather put them in the chat, whatever works best for you. So if you have any questions, let me know. So we'll start off with a bit of a loaded question here. So what is insurance? So insurance is actually a difficult product to sell, but even to just explain. So insurance isn't tangible, premiums are paid, and unless you actually have a loss, you wouldn't really need to use your insurance. So many people have insurance because they're told they need it, but they don't necessarily know what they're actually purchasing. There's a variety of different types of insurance products designed to protect different risks that you as a business owner face. And it doesn't necessarily prevent losses, but it will help you and your business recover in the event that there is a loss and you suffer any interruption to your business. So why would your business need insurance? There's a few different things here, but the main thing is indemnification for losses. So if you have a loss, whether it's a physical loss to your assets, to your revenues, there's different protections in place to help you recover. It'll also give you a lot of peace of mind that if something does happen, you'll be able to recover. Most people don't necessarily have hundreds of thousands of dollars kind of just hanging around waiting for them to use it if something happens. So it gives you the peace of mind that yes, you're paying premium, but you don't need to worry about having to incur those large costs if something does happen. Another benefit to insurance is actually just the professionalism. So oftentimes we'll see on different businesses, on their advertisements, on their billboards, on the side of their vehicles, it'll say licensed and insured. And that really does help. A lot of people prefer licensed businesses and of course insured as well, because if something does happen and you're purchasing a service or a product from someone, if something goes sideways, there's a recourse option for you there. So a lot of clients will actually prefer that, and a lot of businesses purchasing services or products from other companies will actually make it a requirement that you have insurance as well. So some of the different types of insurance that are available. So we'll kind of go over a little bit more in depth some of the main ones, and we'll address some other potentially more obscure types of insurance. But of course, they are all available. So our main one here would be our commercial general liability. We'll review some property insurance. We'll review errors and omissions or professional insurance, commercial auto insurance, business interruption, and then we'll touch briefly on cyber insurance and some other segues there. So first things first, a commercial general liability policy is what we typically consider to be the main type of business insurance. We'll often refer to this as a CGL. So if I do say CGL, that's what I'm referring to. Now, if a business is really looking to get a bare minimum insurance, they just need to get it to say that they have it, we'll typically recommend a CGL. It'll meet most requirements that you'll need, and it does actually provide kind of the most broad coverage. So the keyword here is general. It covers most of the general liability exposures that a business faces on a regular basis, and it'll provide you with typically coverage for allegations of negligence. Now, oftentimes people say, well, I doubt I'll need it. I'm not concerned about my clients suing me. Nothing's going to happen. It doesn't necessarily matter. They always could. And whether or not you're actually found to be negligent, there's a lot of costs incurred if that allegation is even made and it makes its way to court. So there's considerable costs that actually get involved with that. Anybody who's worked with any type of legal professional in the past even 10 years will know that the costs definitely add up. So some of the coverages that are provided would cover your costs, so your legal fees, so whether that's legal counsel, mediation, arbitration, whatever that ends up being, but it'll also cover your judgments. So if you are found guilty through the courts, it will actually pay things like your compensatory damages. So that's great too. And it's typically in addition to your actual limits. So oftentimes we'll hear people mention, $1 million liability or $2 million liability. That'll usually be in and above that limit. So if you incur $300,000 worth of lawyer costs, over a couple of years, it's getting drawn out through the courts, you do have coverage in place for it. And another benefit of general liability policy is really just for compliance. So oftentimes, if you work for others, if you have any grants, if you have a mortgage, if you have any funding, oftentimes they will require that you have liability policy and insurance in place. And this will typically or normally meet those requirements as well. Now, oftentimes people wonder how they can actually go about getting that insurance. So there's really two routes that you can get that liability insurance. So oftentimes people start off their businesses out of their home. It starts off sometimes as a side hustle. It might grow into something bigger. Sometimes it will always stay through your home. It doesn't matter, but regardless, you'll need the insurance coverage. Sometimes you can go through your own home policy and potentially endorse that policy or modify it to extend coverage to your business. Other times you might not be able to. So whether you have a home policy, a tenant policy, or even a condo policy, you might be able to get coverage. Depending on what your business actually does, they may or may not offer it, depending on who you're insured with. So some examples of businesses where a home-based business endorsement may not be available would typically be people who work in spaces outside of their home, if you're visiting clients regularly, if you're registered in a separate legal entity. So if you have a numbered company, an LLC, corporation, whatever your setup is, if it's a separate legal entity, typically a home-based business endorsement is not available to you. It's not exclusive, but typically it's not available. If you're working with anything international, so whether you're providing sales or services to the US, Mexico, any other country other than Canada, typically those are a little bit beyond what a home-based business endorsement is meant for. And especially if you're doing any type of product manufacturing or even some food preparation, sometimes that's, again, beyond the scope of a home-based business endorsement. So it might be available to you, it might not be, but regardless, your best option is to always consult a broker, and we can determine what's best for you and your business, whether that's coverage-wise, price point-wise. We'll always work with you to figure out what's best. So we'll touch on commercial property insurance. This is another one that's pretty important as well. So this is really coverage for your physical assets. Now, a lot of people assume that property means land. However, when it comes to insurance, it means anything physical. So whether that's your contents, stock, equipment, buildings, this is what this product or line of insurance is for. So there are different levels of coverage available. So we can insure your property against a variety of losses ranging from fire or explosion to floods and sewer backup losses. We can really tailor your coverages to meet your needs. And we can even include additional interests like your mortgage company as an additional insured to meet those requirements. Or we can even include leasing companies. So for example, if you're leasing equipment, some businesses will lease a printer, for example, or some larger equipment, manufacturing equipment. If that's the case, we can actually list them as well, and even business loans. So if you're getting a loan specifically from a bank towards a piece of equipment or stock, whatever the case may be, we can include them as well, which is pretty important if it's a condition of your financing or funding. Now, we'll go over errors and omissions insurance. So this is one that is not necessarily talked about, I think, enough, and it's often referred to as professional or malpractice insurance. So most people have heard about medical malpractice coverage. So usually doctors, medical professionals, those types of people have that in case they do something wrong. Now, your regular CGL, so your commercial general liability, will typically not provide coverage relating to services that you provide. So whether that's a service, advice, if you don't do it correctly or you don't provide it when you should have, or it really just doesn't have the anticipated or expected result, and that then results in a loss to your client, you would need an errors and omissions policy to be in place. They're not as, I'll say, fancy as they sound. They are important though. So if you provide any type of consulting services, if you anything that requires like a professional designation, so potentially your lawyers, accountants, architects, engineers, brokers, we of course have those. Anybody really who has a professional designation is typically in the field of a service provider and would typically need this in place. So essentially, if you're providing a service or a direction to someone and that results in a loss to them, they have a recourse option against you. And if you don't have an errors and omissions policy in place, you could potentially suffer a loss. Another line of business that is important as well that would have errors and omissions policies in place is even tattoo artists and hairstylists. If you're doing a service to someone, that can potentially result in a loss as well. So you want to make sure that you're really covered, because especially when it comes to services, the losses can be a lot higher than a typical loss might be. So you want to make sure that you have the proper coverage in place. Now, this is one of probably my more favorite conversations to have with clients here. So commercial automobile insurance. So most people have vehicles that they use for their business to some capacity. We talk about this all the time between myself and my personal lines department and colleagues. They often we're back and forth with clients to determine, what type of coverage do they actually need, because we do want to make sure that you're covered appropriately, and that if something does happen, you haven't been paying insurance for no reason. So the big question is, do I need commercial insurance or not? And oftentimes people will assume that if their vehicle is registered in their personal name, that they're just okay getting personal insurance and they actually can't get commercial insurance. Unfortunately, that's a myth. That's typically not the case. It really comes down to the use of the vehicle. The owner or ownership of the vehicle is essentially irrelevant when it comes down to classifying the insurance. It'll depend largely on the use. So if you're using your vehicle to kind of go to and from client meetings, so someone, for example, like an accountant meeting with clients, that would usually be considered business use, which is how we would rate a personal policy and just rate it for business use. It's essentially commuting, but to different client locations. Now, if you use your vehicle to transport any type of products, materials, your tools, your equipment. If you're making deliveries to clients, that's when you would need a commercial policy because that's deemed to be a commercial use vehicle. Okay, and this is pretty important because in Ontario, and I'll speak specifically to Ontario, but we can discuss any other provinces if anybody's tuning in from elsewhere. But if you're insuring your vehicle personally and you're using it commercially and something happens, there could be concerns for coverage actually being in place. Whereas a commercial policy you can typically use your vehicle for personal use as well. So you don't actually need two policies. You're not needing to insure your vehicle twice. You just need to make sure that you have the proper coverage in place. And one of the big questions that we get is what's the price difference? I've actually seen it be sometimes cheaper to insure it commercially, but typically depending on what you're doing, kind of a standard operation would usually be within 10% or so. So it's not overly drastic in terms of premium difference, but it is something that's definitely important because if you're paying for coverage and you don't actually have anything in the event of a loss, there's no point. Right. So an auto policy similar to a personal policy, it'll provide coverage for your physical vehicle itself, any occupants, so yourself, your passengers, any injuries that you suffer as a result of the accident. It'll of course provide you with the liability coverage for your operation of the vehicle. So if you're driving your vehicle and you run into somebody's house, maybe a local restaurant as well, that'll provide you with coverage for your liability for that property damage or bodily injury that you've caused. And there are also other endorsements available to extend coverage to other things that would include, for example, rental vehicles. So whether it's a loss of use vehicle, so if something happens to your car, it's been in an accident, you can no longer drive it, you're entitled to a rental, it'll pay for the rental. It might even extend the coverage to the rental if you have a vehicle that has attached equipment. So we'll see contractors sometimes that have, for example, a welder attached to their vehicle, any permanently attached equipment, you can provide coverage for that as well. So really you're just looking at protecting your assets again, and similar to a general liability or a property policy, you're covering both the property and the liability kind of packaged into one. And I will note that in Ontario, so actually across Canada, our insurance industry is heavily regulated provincially for automobiles. And in Ontario, it's one of the most regulated and most strict areas. And so it's very kind of cut and dry in terms of what needs to be done and how we can do it. And one thing that people don't necessarily know is everybody actually has the same base policy in Ontario. So I have the same coverage as you do, as your neighbor does, as your friend does. Everybody has the same base coverage. We might have different limits. We may have increased certain options and endorsements, but at the end of the day, there's the minimum requirements that we all have. And we actually all have the same policy wordings as well. So something to keep in mind, if you are trying to kind of shop around or compare, most brokers will end up providing you with comparable coverage, possibly with different companies or potentially different endorsements, but it's, oh, sorry, I flipped that back here. There we go. Sorry, it's flipping pages. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah. Either way, speak with a broker. That's always your best option to determine what's best for you. You might have requirements that you need, but we're there to advise you. We are professionals in our industry. We do need to be licensed, and we kind of go through the education to ensure that we can service you better. So we'll take a look next at our business interruption insurance. So this is something that most people end up purchasing, but don't necessarily know that they've purchased it and might not actually know the differences and what it actually entails. So business interruption is something that's typically only available if you've purchased property insurance. So if you've purchased a standalone commercial general liability, you probably won't be able to purchase business interruption coverage. Now, the reason for that is business interruption coverage provides you for coverage if something happens to physical assets, typically, that then prevent you from continuing your business. So if you rely on physical assets or even locations for your business to continue to operate, business insurance, interruption insurance is definitely something that you should be considering. Now, we do provide coverage depending on who we place you with. There are different endorsements available, different kind of specific limits or coverages provided, but we can provide coverage for costs incurred when an insured event causes an interruption in your operations. So for example, if your retail storefront suffered a fire loss and you could no longer run your business, we could provide coverage for you to set up a new storefront. We might provide you with coverage to pay for your employees' wages. We can indemnify you for the reduced or lost business income. So if you need to set up shop in a different area that has lower traffic, for example, and then you can kind of show that you actually have less revenues, you actually might be able to get coverage for that. And that's something that's really important for people who want to ensure that their business is staying afloat, because generally speaking, if you suffer a major loss, most people can't keep their business running if there's no money coming in the door, especially smaller businesses starting up. It can be really detrimental if you have a lot of stock. For example, you manufacture products. If you've got your stock kind of in your storage room and that catches fire and now you need to wait 6 months to get another shipment of your supplies, that can be detrimental to your business. And this business interruption insurance can help you kind of stay afloat in those times. And as I mentioned, it is only available if you've purchased property insurance. Generally speaking, I haven't seen it. This isn't exhaustive, but I haven't seen it for a liability only policy. So now, we'll go over cyber insurance and other insurances that we have. Now, I did kind of go through those other ones a little bit quicker, but we'll kind of touch on these briefly. They're not necessarily as common as the ones that we normally kind of sell to people, just based on cost. So people will typically, when they're starting off, they're usually getting coverage in place because they need to, they've been told to, not necessarily to build the proper coverage for them, but they're trying to manage their budget and their expenses, right? So these are kind of additional coverages that are available. They're not necessarily costly, but they're kind of those frills that people don't necessarily purchase unless they're kind of forced to. That doesn't mean that they're not important. So one of the big ones is employer's liability. So if you have any type of employees, whether you're administering benefit plans for them, whether it's resulting from your like termination or hiring policies, if you've been negligent, not providing people with the appropriate training and they get injured on the job, you could potentially face a loss. You could be sued. And as I've mentioned, under the general liability, legal costs can add up pretty quick. Now people say, well, there's WSIB for those injuries. Yes, there is. But that doesn't actually preclude your employee from then suing you if you're negligent. So employer's liability really covers a wide variety of potential losses if you have employees. And that's typically, if it's not yourself, sometimes immediate family. And especially even if you're employing subcontractors, that could apply as well. So another one here that we'll kind of go through, and I'll actually get a little bit more in depth about this cyber one here. And this is something that's a little bit more prevalent. So anybody who's local to Thunder Bay or even Ontario that's heard about those casino interruptions in the past couple of weeks because of some ransomware, I think it was the official cause that they've noted. But cyber attacks are pretty common. So anybody who really relies on electronic data or stores data or information on a computer, you're potentially at a pretty high risk of having to pay out some money. So if you have a data breach, so if you hold clients' information in your computer and it's hacked and that information is leaked, there's actually requirements provincially and federally that require you to take certain steps. So there are certain requirements for notifying your clients. There are certain requirements for providing them with credit monitoring services if enough information has been leaked that they could potentially be victims of identity fraud. So those costs add up pretty quick. If you're a larger business, you might actually have to manage your brand. So your branding image, you might need to hire some public relations consultants and people to kind of do some damage control there. You might even need to pay for services to rebuild the data that you've lost. So recreating those records, restoring those records. Depending on what you do, this can be pretty detrimental to your business. And another one that we see a lot is actually ransomware. So they will essentially hold your computer system hostage until you pay a ransom. And this is actually one of the more common ones that we're starting to see. And people think, well, that's not going to impact me. I'm running a small business. It's not going to happen. But we're actually seeing a trend in the smaller businesses suffering these types of attacks. because they're really not expecting it. So hackers and whoever else that's doing this type of hacking, they really have been targeting smaller businesses, and we can get cyber policies in place that'll provide you with pretty high limits of coverage for those types of damages at a pretty reasonable cost. I've seen somebody I just quoted another policy for about $100,000 worth of those coverages, and I believe it was $150 for the year. So we're really not talking about a large premium for what you're getting, and especially with the way that the industry, we've been seeing claims and just the world that we live in, a digital world, cyber insurance can be really important. Now, the other one that I'll kind of touch on here is directors and officers insurance. So this is something that's important for businesses who have a structure that involves a board of directors. So if you have a company who has a board of directors, members of the board could potentially be held personally liable for decisions made by the board and any losses then suffered by it. So directors and officers insurance, we sometimes refer to it as D&O insurance. So D&O insurance can actually protect those members individually. So people think, well, what kind of decision could my board make that would then result in a loss? And I'll actually give you, we have some time here, so I'll tell you a bit of a scenario here that some might seem as ridiculous, but it did actually make it to the courts. So we had a client who had a cooperative. They were a bunch of farmers that got together, decided to set up a rural kind of market stand in these different communities. So they would get together once a month, or I think it was every 2 weeks, and would go set up shop, sell some vegetables. And these little rural communities, they had to typically travel quite a bit. I think it was over an hour to get their produce. So long story short, the board eventually decided to stop doing this. It wasn't profitable for all these farmers to do this. They weren't making enough money, so they shut down. Unfortunately, some members of the community then said, well, you decided to shut down. Now we need to actually travel a lot further again to get our produce, our vegetables, our fresh products. And we're now at a loss because of what you decided to do. And believe it or not, that actually made it to the courts. So again, kind of going back to the general liability, it doesn't matter if you think it's going to be successful or not. As soon as a case makes it to the courts, you're typically going to suffer some type of financial cost, right? So whether that's your defense costs, arbitration, mediation, things make it to the courts quite a bit nowadays. And even if, it gets thrown out a week later, you've incurred some cost, and that's what insurance is there for. So a bit of an update on that situation. It did make it through the courts. It actually took quite a few months to go through the process. Ultimately, the claim was there wasn't any judgment against the defendants, which was the cooperative. But ultimately, they did incur costs, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees were covered by their policy. So this is just an example of what some, again, might consider a ridiculous claim, but it does make it to the courts, and you would have to pay for that. So something to keep in mind there. Now, another great question that people typically have, though, is how to actually get insurance. So this is a pretty hefty question, to be honest. Most people come to us and say, hey, I need insurance. They don't necessarily know what information they need. So I, of course, have lists and lists of information and questions that I ask my clients for when we're going through the process to really underwrite and figure out what they need in terms of coverage. But I made this a little bit more condensed here as kind of a starting point. So main things that we're going to need to know to get you some coverage in place would be really your business name and your type of entity. So that can actually impact the way that we insure your business. So whether you're a sole proprietorship, a partnership, an LLC, a corporation, we need to know that to ensure that we're insuring it properly. Oftentimes people who are starting off will have a registered business name. So you're not necessarily a separate entity, but you do have that name registered. So we would typically have that as an operating name. So we might insure you as Amy Knox, operating as Amy's Auto Service. So there are options. We just need to make sure that we're insuring you correctly, because if we don't have the right name on the policy and something happens, there could be concerns for coverage there. We're also going to need to know about your actual business's operations, including your anticipated revenues. So that's a big thing as well. We need to know what you're actually doing. Are you selling products? Are you providing services? Where are you providing those services? Who are you providing those services to? In what jurisdictions are you selling those products and services. So we have people, for example, who have Etsy shops, and you might sell to somebody in China, you might sell to somebody in Australia, in the US. We need to know that because that is something that is considered by our insurance companies in terms of assessing the risk. Now, another thing that we'll need to know is the actual revenues, because that does actually potentially impact your premium. Oftentimes, again, if you're starting off, this will be something that you might need to guess, or I call it a guesstimate, but we can, of course, amend your policy as it goes. But your revenues do impact your premium for your policy, generally speaking, because if I have a hardware store and out of my garage, for example, and I'm selling $20,000 a year, my premium should be reflective of that versus home hardware who's selling millions, right? So people think, well, no, that's not really relevant. I don't want to share with you my revenues. It is something that's needed. Most insurance companies, I don't know of any actually that would provide you with a quote if you don't even have that information available. So we need to know that, even if it's a guess, we need to know something, because we can't make a fair assessment. Of course, you don't want to be paying the same premium as home hardware might be if they have their millions of revenue. So it is relevant and it will likely help you. So again, we can kind of update that as we go. So I have clients, for example, they think, hey, I'm going to make 15,000. I'm just starting off. It'll be low. And then they call me 6 months later and they say, hey, you know what? I've actually already passed the 15,000. I'm on track to do 50,000 this year. And that's great. We love to see businesses grow, but these are things that we can change as time goes on and as your business grows and as it develops and changes. Things aren't set in stone. We can always make some changes for you. And another thing that's pretty important as well is if you have any specific insurance requirements that you need. So if you have funding, if you have a mortgage, if you have a contract with a client, and they need a certain list of information and coverages provided, let us know. We're not going to say, no, we can't do that. We'll definitely work with you to try to get it done, but we need to know what we're trying to build. Of course, as a broker, we're going to advise you as to what we think you need, what we think you should be getting in terms of your price point, because of course, everybody has a budget. We're not going to sell you all the insurance in the world just to say you have it. We are working for you, but we need to know if there's anything specific that we need to make sure that we're getting you to make sure that you're successful in getting that contract or getting that client or meeting those requirements for your funding. So those 3 points that I've listed here on the slide are really the big ones that I think people really need to have. We can gather information as it goes, as we go down and through the process to actually quote it. But there's a lot more information there. So if it is something that you're looking to get a quote for, at least have those 3 kind of items ready and we can go from there. If you're looking for example, like an auto quote, we'll typically need to know, driver's licenses, vehicle information. So, what's your year, make, and model of vehicle? Who's driving it? Is it you? Is it your neighbor? Is it your employee? And we'll usually need to know kind of where and how you're using that vehicle. So are you doing deliveries? Are you doing it within the city? Are you traveling to other provinces to get materials? What that is. So that's something that we'll need as well for auto policies, but we can usually, like I said, kind of gather that information while we're chatting. And another thing as well is if you're looking to get property coverage, we'll typically need to know details of where that property is being stored. So if we're talking about insuring a building, we're going to need to know, what kind of building is it? Is it a detached home? Are you renting a retail space out of, like a strip mall? How old is the building? Is it a brand new build? Is it old? Do you need to be insuring specific parts of it? Do you own the fixtures that are there? Have you done a bunch of renovations to it? What type of heating is in the building? So really what you would need to provide your insurance company for your home policy, we typically need for a commercial property policy as well. But again, when you speak with a broker, we can of course give you a list of the information and kind of help you figure out what that is to ensure that you're insured appropriately and you're not going to face any issues down the line if anything happens. And we don't want you to be paying premium for coverage that you might not have or be able to get. So those are kind of the big items that we need, but again, we'll always work with you. So I've kind of gone through this a little bit quicker than I thought I would, but I typically go through this quicker because people usually end up having questions. So I know there's not that many people in the chat or in the session today. I know Lori had mentioned that a lot of people would be kind of reviewing it later on because they might not be able to make it at this time, but I'm happy to review questions. Here's my contact information. I am local to Thunder Bay. Oftentimes people will give me a shout, send me an email, we'll set up a time to discuss. But if you want to save my contact information, you can also scan that QR code. It'll let you save it to your phone directly, so you don't need to type that annoying information in. But I'm happy to go through some questions, whether it's specific to your business or general. I'm here to answer those questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Amy. That was really informative. I appreciate it. There was no questions in the chat, but if anybody online has some questions they want to ask, feel free. You could unmute yourself and you can ask away.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Sandra.
Hi, Amy, we've actually met. I'm a co-owner of a resort in the Kawartha Lakes, and you insure it.
Okay.
And yeah, so my question to you is, it's a pet-friendly resort, and I'm hearing things that insurance companies are maybe not insuring the fact that pet-friendly places because of all the problems that dogs could cause. Is that something that we should know about?
So typically speaking, that's we'd have to kind of look at your actual policy, but generally speaking, for pets, if you're not necessarily responsible for those pets, if you have rules in place that the owners are responsible for the pets and responsible for making sure that they're on their leash, for example, that typically goes with whoever's taking care of that pet. So for example, even in a non-commercial situation, if I'm walking my friend's dog and something happens, I actually had control of that dog. If they bite a child, that would actually go on to me and the owner of the pet. So typically speaking, if you don't have any control or I'll say kind of say over keeping that animal safe or other people safe from that animal, that's not usually a concern. Now, if you're running like a doggy daycare type situation, that's a different story, but we can definitely take a look more specifically if that's a concern of yours. But generally speaking, I haven't seen that as an issue.
Okay. It was just a talk show I was listening to on CBC radio, actually, on Saturday, and here we are. So I thought, hey, I'll
always good questions.
Thanks, Amy.
No problem.
Hi, Amy. I have a couple of questions.
For sure.
Just a little background of my business. This is so hard to explain because it seems like a million things. So I have a sole proprietorship. It's called Sophistication, but I have multiple lines to my business. So I'm having questions like for myself about kind of the insurance I have versus what I need and versus what I can do and cannot do. So essentially it started out as, I would say, a cosmetics business, which I have insurance for that. Now 90+% of my revenue is that I design and print bath bomb molds, like with 3D printers that I sell to other makers. And that I never got separate insurance for, but of course it's 90+% of my revenue. That's the reason now I've rented a shop. I've got 16 3D printers. Like it's it's actually, even though probably less from a risk perspective, from an insurance, like potential of causing harm, but it's a lot more investment on my end. So the question I have is that because it's a sole proprietorship, do I need a different name? Because, so to make it even more complicated, like my cosmetics business is basically in Canada. I barely sell anything outside of Canada. It's mostly in person, blah, blah, blah. The molds business is 65+% of my revenue is US. And I have some international and whatever. And so I know once you add US, it adds more liability. And so it's very much harder to get insurance, but it's like, it's not at the same level as the cosmetics. So I'm like, do I need to rebrand the cosmetics, so that I can get 2 different policies, or should I be getting 1 policy, or, things like that. And then I'll throw in there to just add a little extra, whatever. Now that I have a shop, I've been wanting for years to start doing workshops, like make your own soap, make your own bath bomb, make your own whatever, right? Fun, like sip and whatever. And so then it's like, okay, now that could potentially be adding another kind of product line that now is back into the risk category, but not as risky as into the US, right? So I'm just trying to see what I need now versus what I need to think about in the future, and whether adding other brands is the way to go, or because I'm a sole proprietor, it doesn't matter what the number of brands are. It's all technically me. And so therefore it's really just one policy that I need to get to cover everything.
Yeah, so I'll give you kind of I'll say an overview answer. And if you wanted to take, have a more very specific conversation offline, we definitely can. But generally speaking, when you're getting into bigger operations and those different streams, if your operations are completely kind of separate, like now you're doing manufacturing versus you're doing kind of your cosmetics, oftentimes people from a legal perspective will actually set up separate legal entities for those so that you're not personally on the hook if something happens, right? So usually if we have a separate legal entity, we'll have a separate policy in place for you, which will typically make it cheaper depending on your operations. Because if we need to find somebody who's okay, like an insurance company, if we're trying to find an insurance company who's okay doing the US exposure, the manufacturing, like with your 3D printing, all of that, they might not necessarily be our best company that we would insure cosmetics with. So if they're very separate, if we need to only find one insurance company who's willing to take everything as a whole, that might actually make it a little bit harder for us to find insurance for you and really reduce or limit our options in terms of who's willing to insure that. If you keep it separate, I'm not a lawyer, so this isn't legal advice, but we generally see people separate those legal entities to kind of protect themselves and not have those under sole proprietorship. But at the end of the day, if it's all under your name and that's what you've chosen to do, we can typically find you coverage kind of as one package for all of your operations. We can do that, but again, it'll be limiting our options and will more than likely, in your situation that you've described, will likely result in higher premium. So that would be my kind of, I guess, take on.
I didn't throw in the extra complication that I'm a US citizen. And so I've kind of been semi-advised not to set up a corporation because from a tax perspective, it's just like extra annoying to be an American citizen owning a Canadian corporation.
Yeah.
And so I just like to add in all sorts of complications. Okay.
Yeah,
so it sounds like if it's a sole proprietorship, it doesn't matter how many registered business names I have. It's really just one business from an insurance perspective.
Because you're one legal entity at the end of the day. We'll want to know what your different operating names are so that we, of course, are listing those. So if it's, like I mentioned, Amy Knox operating as so-and-so, Amy's automotive service, or, Amy's antique collections, Amy's cosmetics, whatever those are, we'll want to know that just to make sure that we're, again, covered appropriately.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so that gets rid of my name change rebranding questions and my add on other business services questions. So then the other question I had is around the commercial auto thing. So like if I am shipping things and I'm bringing the packages to the post office in my car, is that considered one that, what I mean? Like you said, like bringing product, right? So I don't know, is that considered that? Or like I'm going and buying supplies from a store, and so I'm using my car to go to the Costco or whatever, and maybe I get some personal things too, but I'm definitely, whatever, right? So are those all things that I really should be thinking, this is something that
Are you based out of Ontario? Are you in Ontario?
Yes, I'm in the Toronto area.
Okay, yeah, no problem. That would typically be considered a commercial operation or use of your vehicle. If you're purchasing supplies and materials and you're, bringing those with your vehicle, that's going to be part of your business operation. Even delivering them to Canada Post to get that shipped out, you're not necessarily delivering it direct to your client, but it's still a delivery to some extent. That would be typically considered a commercial exposure, yes.
Okay, and then as I mentioned, I have the US citizenship. So I drive back to the States often enough, several times a year. I'm driving to Boston. So is that a potential issue that I'm like, it's a major, more miles are going onto my car driving to Boston, back and forth to Boston than they are driving around the Toronto area. So, or sorry, more kilometers. I've been here for 10 years and I still use it interchangeably.
I mean, we still say mileage, right? So it's,
yes, exactly.
Now, are you
so
going to Boston personally or for like business?
It's
personally?
99% like it's personal, but now like there's a thought in my head, like at some point, if I'm doing the workshops, is that something that I now offer as like but it's not I'm always thinking about whether or not I expand and whatever. So it's always on the mind, but right now it's always a personal thing. Although because products are cheaper in the US, many times I have things delivered to like my parents, you know, and I'm bringing them back with me along with all my other things, right? So
yeah, so US exposure for commercial policies we'll typically want to know about. It doesn't mean that we can't insure them, we just need to know about it. And if it's like a one-off, like if you're going, you know, every week to pick up products, that's going to be a higher risk that we're looking to insure appropriately. If it's like a one-off, we would typically let your insurance company know and say, hey, you know what, the vehicle will be in the US. Majority is personal or pleasure use, but it is being used, you know, to potentially bring products back. You know, we'll typically want to know how far from the border you're going, you know, the frequency. For commercial insurance, the actual mileage, the overall annual mileage doesn't actually impact you as much as a personal policy would. It really comes down to your radius of operations. So we want to know, you know, you're working from your home primarily, you're driving around Toronto, you know, everything's kind of within a 25-kilometer radius. We'll want to know what your normal radius is and kind of what percentage of your operations are within that section, and then, or territory, I should say, and then how often you're going beyond that. So what's your maximum radius? Are you doing a lot of operations, you know, every month, a few times a month, you're going 300 kilometers elsewhere? We'll just want to know it's pretty much the region of where you're operating that is the main concern when it comes to commercial use.
okay, thank you.
No problem. I hope I answered that question.
I think so. And I may call, because I know I'm asking very specific questions, and I started to try and get a policy from like all these questions. I was like, this doesn't apply to my business, doesn't apply, you know, it was like, what's the warning you're putting on? I'm like, there's no warning for molds. Like, it's just not, you know, so I just kind of put it on the shelf and never got back to it. So,
yes. So oftentimes our insurance companies will have application forms, and depending on who you're working with or who you've worked with, they might send you one company's application forms, and it might be kind of like a more broad application that would apply to, you know, 40 different businesses. So that's something that's difficult. But if you speak with somebody in a broker, for example, and we kind of figure out, okay, this is more so what you're doing, we'll typically find you applications or ask you the questions that are more specific to your business. We might still need to fill them out and they might not be applicable. So we'll just say, you know, not applicable. But at the end of the day, the insurance companies, for the most part, have some more kind of generalized applications if it's not a very specific or specialized industry.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
Mimi, this is Tanya. I have a question.
Sure.
I am currently not insured
Okay.
because I haven't, it's what I'm doing is really a hobby that's gone way out of control.
Yep.
And I buy and sell vintage furniture and decor and everything in between. Vintage, luxury, just anything super cool, I buy it.
Okay.
And I've been a great finder, and I have a massive collection. And so much so that I had went for a long time. Of course, I filled up every square inch extra in my home, garage, shed, basement. And I was renting storage units. And what I was finding is I'd literally just dump and run. Like I'd pick something up and dump it and never deal with it again. So what I found is it's best to have something close to home. So lo and behold, in July of like almost a year ago, I found a warehouse, which is actually a barn on a farm. It's not a commercial zone or anything like that, but it is 5 minutes from my house. And at almost 3,000 square feet, I have it filled with amazing treasures that, honest to God, is my life. Like, this is my work. I'm actually just today probably finally going to have my studio space, my staging zone that is nice enough to showcase some of these beautiful pieces I have. I do sell to Canada's top designers, film, and people from all over the place. Mostly I don't do Etsy or anything yet. However, I should, because some littles are worthy of shipping anywhere.
Of course.
Expanding my market. So what I've got is this barn in the middle of freaking nowhere. There is people on site and there are cameras around, literally out there. I don't lock it, like, it's because you could get in, like, it's a barn. But my life is in there. Like, if it was to burn down, for example, they have a burn pile because it's a farm, right? Not too far from me. And they said, yeah, well, we'll burn it in the winter. And I'm like, oh, good. Like, just let me know. And they said, yeah, we do it in the winter, when there's snow on the roofs, because it's a more like a Quonset, the tarp over top of a barn frame. So a curved top. So nevertheless, I have to deal with insuring my collection. And at this stage, now that I'm finally getting this studio space ready, I'm going to be listing it in fast form. And so my collection will decrease, thankfully, because I have not been in really buying mode. So, but also I want to, because a lot of photographers buy from me or rent from me or whatever, and I want to set up, I've had interest of people for high-end staging, et cetera, film often, and I just kind of one off a price or whatever and trust them. I don't have anything in writing. I just, if I get a good feeling, I'm like, oh, whatever. So moving forward, I have to set this up. And because I'm developing these nicer studio spaces within my barn, which is a beautiful location, I'm going to offer photographers, because I have this space, I may as well leverage some funds out of that. And what I originally planned in July of last year was I'm going to kind of amalgamate everything, list everything, and decrease what I have and rent out the space or a large portion of it for, like, winter storage, boats, motorcycle, I don't know. And these are my insurance questions that I have.
Okay. Yeah, so right off the top, you'd definitely be looking at property insurance. So for the space,
I'm renting.
Yeah, so you would need property insurance in terms of your actual contents. So typically you'd have a general liability in place. So that'll, as kind of I mentioned earlier, your general liability will typically have an extension of coverage in there that will extend your liability to premises that you lease. So that way, if somebody does come to your studio or your space and, slips and falls, that's always my go-to example, because people kind of resonate with that. Slips and falls and sues you, your liability is extended there. You'd be looking at coverage for the contents as well. So I know you mentioned that you'd be likely offloading some stock.
Oh, yes.
I'm
always offloading stock. Like, even now, if my house burnt down, it's way more, it's way more than just my house, because I've got pieces that I would never buy for myself, like, that are so pricey. You know what I mean?
For sure. Yeah, so typically when it comes to kind of people that are buying and selling inventory of types, we usually have, if it's seasonal, we'll deal with that then, but usually we'll insurance say, okay, like, what's the maximum amount you'd have? You might say, I might have $200,000 worth of stuff here, but most of the time it's, 50,000, but max would be 200. So we would typically determine what kind of limit you're looking for. If it's something that you need to, increase or decrease throughout the policy term, we can always change policies as well. But you'd definitely be looking at a general liability, your contents, and then really in terms of the actual exposure, though, we would just need to know about what you're actually renting out space-wise. Like, if you're renting out some of the products for people to use, if you're having people come in to rent the space. Now, I will note that if you are storing anybody's, I think you mentioned motorcycles, boats, things like that.
Yes.
That's a whole other ballgame. I'll say that.
Because people do that in barns all the time, like all the time. But I was that was another fear that I had, because I was hoping to kind of offset. If I was smart and unloaded my product before winter, I could have basically paid my rent off of renting out, 3/4 of that space.
And people
the
do that
year.
quite a bit. And depending on which area you're in, oftentimes people will do it without actually your broker or your insurer knowing about it, which is less than ideal. But essentially, when it comes down to it, legally speaking, if you are storing or providing storage for people's items and something happens, you could actually be on the hook for those. So if you're storing somebody's boat and that
Yes.
breaks down, you actually have storage control over that. And you could be on the hook for the value of that boat or that motorcycle. If you're getting into items or vehicles that are plated, that's a very separate policy as well. So it kind of complicates things. It doesn't make things impossible, but it would definitely make things a little bit more unique in terms of your insurance needs.
Would you suggest that venture is, should something happen, it's not even worth doing?
I think it would depend on, what your revenues are what you're looking at and the value of the items that you're storing. Because, if you're storing people's bicycles that are worth, I don't know, $20,000, or sorry, motorcycles, I should say, $20,000 versus somebody's yacht that's worth a couple of $100,000. Those are very different limits of coverage that you need. So we would just need to know what that actually entails. But we can, if you want to have a conversation offline, we can kind of take a look and we can get into more specifics if you'd like.
Amy, sorry, there was something here. Teresa was just asking, she missed the beginning of the presentation. Did you talk about how and when to getting business insurance? If you could, or I could give her the recording too.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I didn't really specifically address that, but essentially as soon as you start doing anything business related, you should have a policy in place, because you'll typically have that exposure. Even if you only have a couple of clients, the chance that something happens might be low, but it still exists. So typically we recommend people, as soon as you start, get your coverage in place. And as I mentioned, premium is reflective of your revenue. So even if it's small, it's typically a lot more manageable right from the get-go. But if you start a business, even if, like I said, you have a couple clients, something could go sideways and you could be at a serious financial loss there if something happens. So we definitely recommend it as soon as you start.
And she's asking if there was a basic plan, or can I tack on to my home insurance?
Yeah, so we did kind of go through that a little bit as well. The home-based business, I think it's, sorry, I can switch back slides here. Home-based business versus commercial. So if you're looking back at the recording, if you missed that, we can take a look, but it'll really depend on what your operations actually are. If it's something small, just out of your home, that doesn't involve anything major like international operations, product manufacturing, food things, or items where, ventures where you're going to other locations for. Oftentimes we can insure those under a home-based business policy, but it'll really depend on who your home insurance is with and what they actually want to insure.
Perfect, thank you. Is there any other questions?
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, no problem. And if, like I said, if anybody has any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. My contact information is listed there. I am local to Thunder Bay, but I have clients across a few different provinces. As I mentioned, I do some business in Manitoba and Alberta as well. So if you want to get in touch, phone, email, whatever works for you.
Okay, and one last thing. Teresa said that will significantly increase her insurance costs.
For a home-based business policy, it'll depend on your revenues, because that will be a factor as well. But a home-based business policy endorsement, you're usually looking at a couple $100s, typically speaking. An actual separate commercial policy, which, to be honest, a commercial policy is a bit more broader coverage than a home-based policy, typically speaking. But those ones will usually see minimum premium around $500 a year. Depending on your operations, it might be higher, but usually 500 is the lowest that we'll see a policy come in at.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Amy. We really appreciate you coming in and discussing this information. Please, everybody, you can reach out to Amy and she'll be more than happy to help you. And thanks everybody for joining us today. And we hope to see you again sometime soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Enjoy your day.
Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.